Um, so James has talked to us about semantic patterns in names and how culturally people chose names around certain themes and so on. And it's important to recognize that this is true not just in the Bible, but also outside the Bible, because this helps us to recognize that this is a historical reality, not just a literary reality. But I want to turn now to the literary question, which someone has just raised, about name bestowal or name giving in the Bible. And you may be aware that there are several passages, about 50 of them, where names are given and explanations for those names are given, either by the narrator of the story or by a parent or by the Lord, by God sometimes. Sometimes also names are changed. And of course, names like Abraham or Sarah come to mind. And often explanations are given for those as well. So I want to spend some time thinking about the question, how do the meanings of names relate to the biblical explanations for them? How do the meanings of names in the Bible relate to biblical explanations for them? Now, what's interesting is that the Bible actually has more of these kind of name explanations than any other culture that I'm aware of. So I study ancient Mesopotamia and Ugarit and places like that in the ancient Near East. I'm not aware of many texts. I'm aware of really only one text in which, in any sense, a name is possibly explained, and it's in a literary context in Mesopotamia. They're pretty rare. So we get a lot of these in the Bible. And as I'll point out later, we get a lot of these particularly in Genesis. So how do the meanings of names relate to the biblical explanations that we find for them? Here's an example of the sort of thing that I mean. So this is for the name Manasseh in Genesis 41:51. So Johnson has told me that 40% of you know Hebrew. So I thought it might be worthwhile to actually look at some Hebrew together. I've given you in each case in my slide an English translation from the ESV, but then the Hebrew text is on the left here, and it actually matters for us for some of the phenomena that I want to look at. Here I want to look at the name Manasseh, and the text says Joseph called the name of his firstborn, Manasseh, for, he said, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. And if you know the story of Joseph, of course, that will make a lot of sense. Joseph was really run out of his father's house by his brothers, sold into slavery. And so he's referring back to that in the naming of his son. Now, what I want you to observe here is that you have this word for here in the English. It corresponds to key here in the Hebrew, which is a fairly common way of introducing an explanation for a name. The name Manasseh is here in the Hebrew text, Menashe. And then the verb for the explanation of the name is here, Nashani. And so the text reads, he names his firstborn Manasseh for Ki, Nashani, Menashe, Ki, Nashani, Elohim, God caused me to forget all my troubles and all the house of my father. Now, the name Manasseh, Menashe, sounds a lot like Nashani. It has some assonance, we say, right, between the two words. So Menashe has the consonants in and shin and hey in shin, hey, and Nashani is also composed of the root nasha in shin hey. So they share not only a meaning, to cause to forget, but also a lexical root. The root word you look up in the dictionary is shared between Menashe and Nashani. And then, of course, there is the shared meaning. So we have these kind of three categories of similarity or correspondence. So I want us to think in terms of connections between names given in the Bible and explanations about those names as having various types of correspondences, which are intermingled in various ways, various rather complex ways, although it's quite simple in the case of Manasseh. One type of correspondence that we see between names and explanations of names in these texts is semantic correspondence, correspondence in meaning. There will be a correspondence between the meaning of the name and the explanation given for it. There may also be lexical correspondence. So there might be correspondence between the words used in the name and the explanation given for it, as we saw with Manasseh. And then there may be a phonological correspondence in the sounds of the name. So to return to our example in Manasseh, we have the same lexeme used. So there's lexical correspondence, nasha. There's semantic correspondence because it's the same kind of meaning. Manasseh means one who makes forget. And the explanation is that God has made me forget all my hardship. So that's semantic correspondence. And then there's also phonological correspondence. Menashe kind of sounds like nashani. They're shared sounds. There's assonance between them. Now, these are kind of three ways in which names and explanations for names can be related. And there are a few cases, like Manasseh, where the connections are pretty straightforward. All three of those levels of correspondence are there in this name, with this name. And the same is true in a few other cases, like with Dan, for example. So here we have Rachel naming Dan. So the text says, and Rachel said, Danani Elohim, God has judged me. And also he has listened to my voice and he's given to me a son. Therefore, she called his name Dan. So Danani kind of sounds like Dan. There's assonance between them. They're also from the same root, Dan, which means to judge. And they're similarly, they mean the same thing, or more or less the same thing here. So God judged, Danani, and Dan is either a participle, one who judges, judge, or it's a perfected verb form, he judged. Either way, it fits the context pretty well. And so we have a kind of simple correspondence between the two things, the name and its explanation here. But there are cases where things are not quite so straightforward. This is not so different from our previous examples, but you can begin to see some difference between the name itself and the explanation of the name. So this is the name Ishmael and the context in which the name is given, where Hagar gives, or really the angel of the Lord tells Hagar to give Ishmael this name. The text reads, and the angel of the Lord said to her, that is to Hagar, behold, you are pregnant or have become pregnant, and you will bring forth a son, and you will call his name Yishmael, because Shama Yahweh El Onik, because Yahweh, the Lord, has heard or listened to your affliction. And so you see this key again right here, because here, previously it was translated for, but here's the introduction to the explanation that was similarly, and in a similar construction to what we saw with Manasseh. And the first part of Ishmael's name, this part here, is shared in the explanation with the verb, shama. So this is shama, he heard, he listened. And Yishma is the first element, the first word in Yishmael's name. Yishmael has two words in it. Yishma, he heard, and the subject of Yishma, God, El, this last part in blue right here. Now the explanation here has Shema corresponding to Yishma. So there's a correspondence at the lexical and semantic and phonological level. Yishma and Shama sound similar. They mean the same thing and they're from the same word. But El and Yahweh are kind of synonyms. El is God, it's a reference to God, and Yahweh is God's name. So you can see that there's a correspondence here semantically between the name, Yishmael, and the explanation given for it, but there are also some differences introduced. Now, we get a bit of a different, slight variation on this type of difference with the name of Sarah. Sarah is a very interesting case. You remember Sarah's name was changed when the Lord was making his covenant with Abraham, and Abraham's name was changed, as we'll see in a moment as well. And the types of things that happen in the change between these names is very interesting. And you can see how the two names in the change from one to the other have correspondences, but there are also correspondences between the new name that these people are given and the explanation given for it. And so with Sarah, the text reads, and God said to Abraham, Sarai, your wife, you will no longer call her name, but rather Sarah, right? You will not call her name Sarai, because Sarah is her name. And there it is in the English text. Now, Sarai here is the early name, the first name, Sarah's first name. And this name, so far as I can see, means something like princess. So if you know some Hebrew, star might be a word that you've learned. It means something like prince or ruler. It's a fairly common word in the ancient world. And here we have Sar with this I ending, and I think that's probably a diminutive. It refers to a kind of it refers to as a kind of small instance of a Sar, a ruler. So she's a princess, as far as I can see. Now, when the name is changed, that Sar root is kept; it's retained in Sarah here. But instead of this I ending, Sarai, that we have here, we have Sarah with AH. You can see it also in the Hebrew here, Sarah, which, as far as I can see, sort of upgrades the name to mean something like queen. So she's moved from princess to queen. And if you continue reading in the text, that corresponds to something we find later on in the text. It reads, I will bless her, and also I have given from her to you a son, and I will bless her, and she will become nations. She will be nations, and kings of peoples from her will be. Now, this word kings right here in the blue is the normal kind of word you might have learned for king, melech in Hebrew. And malak is the word for to rule in Hebrew. It's the normal word for rule. So we have kind of synonyms here between malak, melech here, and sar, ruler, between Sarah's new name and the explanation given for it. So there's similarity here at the semantic level between the new name and the explanation for it, but it doesn't use the same word, and we don't have phonological similarity of sounds. But we do have all of that between the old name and the new one. Now, a bit more complex similarity correspondence occurs also with Abram and his name change. It's very interesting. The text reads, no longer shall your name be called Avram. Here's Avram in the Hebrew text. And you can see that it has also two elements or two words, of, this first part, of, which means father, and then Ram, which means exalted. It's the exalted word. It's a participle probably. It means father is exalted, taken together. But rather, your name will be Avraham. Now, if you look at these names, Avram and Avraham, you can see that the only difference between Avraham and Avram is the addition of this ha syllable. Now, I think what's going on there is that we have just a different form of the same word in the second element. So Avram is changed to Raham. Now, those are the same root word in Semitic languages, but in some languages, there'll be an H in the middle, and in other languages, there won't be. In Hebrew, there normally isn't one for this exalted word. Now, what has that achieved, really? I mean, it hasn't achieved much necessarily in terms of the meaning of the name, but if we continue to read, we'll see that the explanation is because a father of a multitude, of Hamon, of nations, I have given you. And so here we have the word Hamon combined with of. Hamon is composed of the consonants H and M, which are also the last two consonants of Abraham's new name. And of is retained. So if we leave out the R and we think in terms of and ham, we have a sound correspondence, a phonological correspondence between Avraham, or of and ham, and of Hamon. And so to signify Abraham's future role in really God's overall purposes in the world as a father of a multitude of nations, really a sound has been added, which fits linguistically, it works. The name's meaning hasn't been changed, but it does fit in terms of sounds. So we've seen then that you can have lexical correspondence and semantic correspondence and sound correspondence sort of neatly there, as in Manasseh and Dan. But things can become a bit more complex with certain names, and scholars have really tripped over this. Scholars have found it hard to explain this in the West now, and I think this is at least partly to do with the fact that we tend to think in terms of linguistics and the cognates that we can find between words and between languages and linguistics. And when we find that in the ancient world they didn't necessarily think that way, we find this difficult to comprehend. But it's clear that this sort of comparison was perfectly appropriate in the ways that they thought about language. Now, Noah is a similar example, though maybe slightly less complex. It's a remarkable text, right? When Lamech had lived 182 years, he fathered a son and called his name Noah. So here we have Noach saying, this one will give us comfort, or will bring us relief. Yinachamenu, from our work and from the toil of our hands, from the ground which the Lord has cursed. Now, if you think to the background of this, of course, this verse is referring back to Genesis 3, where because of people's sin, the Lord has cursed the ground. And there's the question, then what will God do? What will happen with humanity and with God's world? And Lamech here is signifying that something's beginning to happen with Noah. And there's something to do with the meaning of Noah's name, or something about Noah's name. Noah is derived from the normal Hebrew word meaning to rest. And Nacham, the root word here in the verb, out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief, is a different root, Nacham versus Noach, and it means a slightly different thing, to comfort or to bring relief, whereas Noah's name means to rest. But they're similar. They're kind of overlapping ideas, right? Noah to rest, Nacham to bring comfort, bring rest, bring relief. And so what the narrator has done here, what Lamech has done, is to show the correspondence between the meaning and the sound of Noah's name and the meaning and the sounds of Nacham, his explanation, in a kind of lighter way than we've seen so far. They don't correspond lexically, but they do correspond semantically and in terms of sounds. Noach and Yinachamenu sound similar as well. Now, Samuel's name is a very interesting case. Most of the examples of these types of name explanations that we find are in Genesis, but we do have a few from later on in the biblical text. And the explanation of Samuel's name in 1 Samuel 1 is a good example of how complex these things can become. You'll remember the story, of course, is that Hannah was barren, and she asked the Lord, she went to worship the Lord, and she asked the Lord to give her a son, and he did. And here the text tells us, 1 Samuel 1:20, in due time Hannah conceived, and she brought forth a son, and she called his name Shemuel. Because, here's that because, which introduces the explanation of the name. For she said, I have asked for him from the Lord. Now, if we read the text in Hebrew, Vatikra et Shemuel, ki me Adonai she'iltiv. So we have these similar sounds going on in the explanation of the name, Shemo, Shemuel, she'iltiv. You can hear the assonance between the consonants. And if we look at the name Samuel, we can see that it doesn't correspond at the level of the words chosen. There isn't lexical correspondence, nor indeed is there any kind, so far as I can see, of semantic correspondence. Samuel's name means name of God, Shemuel. You may be familiar with the word Shem, name in Hebrew. It's essentially that. And here is a form of Shem here at the beginning of Samuel's name. Here is the word for God, and Samuel's name then means name of God, or maybe offspring of God. This is a fairly common name in Samuel's time. We have lots and lots of examples of this name, Shemuel, in extra biblical documents from the time of Samuel and even before Samuel's time. And so I think that what Hannah's doing here is to draw a name from the name repertoire of her time, the fairly common name, which has similar sounds to the word that she uses to characterize the significance of Samuel in relation to God, right? She asks for God to give her this child, and God gave her this child. Shemuel corresponds to the word in Hebrew for ask, which we find here in sounds. Sha'al and Shemuel are similar. And so much of Hannah's explanation for why she named Samuel this way is to do with the fact that she asked for Samuel from the Lord, and the Lord gave him to her. It only occurs, this word for ask, sha'al, only occurs one time here in this in this verse. But if we continue to read in the story down in verses 27 and 28, in those two verses alone, sha'al, the root sha'al, to ask in Hebrew, which sounds similar to Shemuel, happens no less than 4 times in the course of these verses when she's explaining how Samuel was born to Eli, when she goes back to worship the Lord later, she says to him, "For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition, she'elati," which is from the root sha'al, to ask. The Lord granted my petition, which I asked. Here it is a second time in that verse, from him. And also, I myself have loaned him, or given him back, dedicated him, also from sha'al, to the Lord, all the days that he is. And he is asked, sha'ul, he's one who is asked or lent to the Lord. And so in her explanations, Hannah repeats this ask notion. She asks for Samuel from the Lord, and he is an asked for child, and she's given him back now. And his name sounds similar to this verb. And so Hannah herself, in the explanation of her naming, makes this correspondence, and it seems to be limited to the phonological level. Now, some rather gross applications of this kind of phonological correspondence happens in Genesis 19, which is the story of how Lot, after having come out of Sodom when it's been destroyed with his daughters, and his wife is turned to salt, and Lot and his daughters go up into the mountain, and the daughters decide that they're going to sleep with their father and commit incest and produce children from him. And so the text here reads in Genesis 19, verses 36 and 37, "So the two daughters of Lot conceived from their father, me'avihen," me'av are the sounds that we want to pay attention to there, me'avihen. "And the elder, the firstborn, brought forth a son, and she called his name Moav," which kind of sounds like Me'av. Moav. He is the father of Moab until today. So Moab, as you know, Moab is the name of the Transjordan state, kingdom across the Jordan, with whom the Israelites had a fair amount of interaction in the course of their history. And so this passage gives the origin of these people as being from this incestuous relationship between Lot and his daughter. And you'll notice that there's a sound correspondence. I confess I don't know what Moav means, but there is a sound correspondence such that Moav sounds similar to from father. And so this boy is called from father, and it's true in a double sense, both in the sense that he's from his own father and also from his mother's father, which is a striking correspondence. And then something similar happens also with his brother, Ben-Ami, who comes from his aunt. So the younger also, she brought forth a son, and she called his name Ben-Ami. Ben-Ami. He is the father of Bnei Ammon, the sons of Ammon until today. The sons of Ammon are, of course, the Ammonites, as we can see here in the translation. Now, Ben-Ami can be translated son of my people, but it may actually go back to a different meaning of Ami. You may know as a word for people, and that's perfectly right in Hebrew. But in older times, especially, and in other languages, can mean grandfather. And so there's a sense in which this name means, I think it does mean, son of my grandfather, which may, in an extended sense of the word ben, son, normally be true of anyone, son of grandfather, in the sense of offspring of grandfather. But in the case of Ben-Ami, the son of Lot, he was both son of his father and son of his grandfather at the same time. So the names of these people seem to reflect something of the gross incestuous relationship that was there between Lot and his daughters. Joseph reveals to us a kind of different angle in the complexities and the layering that can happen between the phonological and the semantic and the lexical relationships between the name and its giving. So here, Rachel she conceived, and she brought forth a son, and she said, Asaf Elohim et cherpati, God has gathered or taken away my reproach. Now, this word taken away, Asaf here, sounds similar to Joseph's name. Asaph kind of sounds like Yosef. They share two consonants, so there's assonance between them. And then she goes on, Vatikra et Shemo, and she called his name Yosef, Lemor, saying, Yosef Adonai li ben acher. Yahweh, either may the Lord add, or the Lord has added, maybe, to me another son. Of course, her maidservant Bilhah has produced a son already for her, and she's regarded that boy as her son. It may be that this means Yosef, the Lord has added, meaning Joseph, or it may mean may the Lord add Yosef, may the Lord add another son, and of course he does, namely Benjamin. But you'll notice in this case that the verb used in the explanation here is pretty much identical with Joseph's name. The Lord either has added or will add, may the Lord add, is essentially how we might translate Yosef. So there is sound correspondence between her initial statement on the birth of the child. The Lord God has taken away Asaph, my reproach. There's sound correspondence between Asaph and Yosef, Joseph's name. But there's sound and lexical and semantic correspondence between Yosef, Joseph's name, and the explanation given for the name in Rachel's own words. Moses presents us with another type of layering of correspondences between the name and the explanation. In this case, between two different languages, Hebrew and Egyptian. You'll know, of course, that Moses was raised in Egypt, was born there, and he was raised in the house of Pharaoh by Pharaoh's daughter. And we're told that, of course, in Exodus 2. When the text in verse 10 reads, the child grew older, the boy grew older, and she, that is his mother, brought him to the daughter of Pharaoh, and he became her son. He was to her for a son. And here's the Hebrew word for son, ben, occurs in the narrative. And then the narrative continues. She named him Moses. She called his name Moshe here, which sounds like the Egyptian word Moseh, which means son. So it may well be that Moses' name sounded like good Egyptian, son. But the text continues, she said, because from the water I drew him. Now the word drew is mashah. It's in Hebrew the same root as Moshe. Mashah, draw, and Moshe, the name. So what we have here then is a correspondence not only between the Hebrew word mashah, to draw, which is relevant for Moses' story. He was taken up out of the Nile River where he was put when Pharaoh wanted to kill off all the boys. Mashah, he was drawn up, and therefore Moshe fits with that. But it also fits with Egyptian, which is relevant for him because, of course, he's living in an Egyptian house and could easily have often been called Moseh by his adoptive Egyptian mother. So we have correspondence at lexical, semantic, and phonological levels between two languages here, between Egyptian and Hebrew. Now, this is the last example that I want to show you to represent the kind of complexity that can happen. This is the story of Naval. This is a kind of singular case in one sense, because, of course, Naval means foolish. And this is a story in which the name is explained and used, played upon by Naval's wife, Abigail, when she's speaking to David. Now, you may remember the context of the story. David has been run out of Saul's court because Saul repeatedly tried to kill him, and Saul chases David, so David has to flee, and he's gathered these men around him. He's got 600 fellows out in the wilderness hiding from Saul. It's a feast time, so he sends to Naval, whose shepherds he and his men protected and taken care of while we're out with their sheep. He sends to Naval at this feast time and asks for food. And Naval is an evil man. So we know from the narrator of the story in 1 Samuel 25:3, the name of Naval, the name of the man was Naval. And if you're a Hebrew speaker, you know that one meaning of that, at least, the most common meaning in the Bible, is foolish. So Naval sounds like foolish to you. The name of the man was Naval, foolish. And the name of his wife, Abigail. The woman was discerning and beautiful, but the man was harsh and badly behaved. He was a Calebite. That has relevance for me because my name is Caleb. I'm not sure whether it means that he was from a clan named after the biblical figure Caleb, a Calebite, settled around Hebron, or possibly it means just like his heart, which you can see there in the Hebrew at the end. It's what it could mean literally. Or it could mean Calebite in the sense that he's like a dog, Caleb's dog. It's possible that some comparison with a dog is being made here. Either way, it's clear Nabal is a fool and he's badly behaved. We know right from the start as readers, he's badly behaved in contrast to his wife, who's discerning and beautiful. And all of those characteristics of these two people will become live issues as the narrative unfolds. When David sends his men to ask Nabal for food, Nabal responds in keeping with his character in a harsh and disgraceful way, and he scorns David. And the messengers come back to David, and as you know from the story, David straps on his sword. He tells his men to strap on their swords, and they set out to kill all the men in Nabal's house. Bad things are about to happen, both from Nabal's point of view and to David, because David is taking his own vengeance, which is not something he should be doing. Meanwhile, though, one of the young men in Nabal's house, who will be killed if things continue as they are, comes to Abigail, comes to Nabal's discerning wife, and he tells her, "Now therefore know this, and consider what you should do, for harm is determined against our master and against all his house, and he is such a worthless man that no one can speak to him." So we learn two things from this. One, that Abigail's the lady to go to if you want to get something wise done. This young man knows that. And two, that Nabal, the master, is known to be a worthless man. He's known among his staff to be worthless. And so here we have this young man trying to save everyone's life by going to the wise one in the marriage. And so, as you know, Abigail then takes a lot of food. She goes and meets David on his way. She stops him from taking his own vengeance. And very discerningly, she tells him why all of this has happened. She says in verse 25, "Let not my Lord regard this worthless fellow, the son of Belial, the son of worthlessness, Nabal. For his name, as his name is, so is he. As his name, so is he. Nabal, foolish is his name, and folly, Nevalah, is with him. But I, your servant, did not see the young men of my Lord whom you sent." So Abigail plays on the name of Nabal, foolish, and she uses that as a ground for explaining how he acts, how he is. And you know the rest of the story, of course, is that David does nothing, and the Lord actually kills Nabal in the end. Abigail goes home, finds him drunk, tells him the next morning what has happened. Nabal's scared to death, his heart stops, and the Lord kills him within days. And so the foolish man comes to a foolish end. So we have Nabal and Nevalah. We have an explanation for the name. And one of the things that we can see here is that the meanings of names were clear to people. They knew what the names meant in these biblical characters. They were transparent to a speaker of Hebrew. And this is regularly what we find. And Abigail knew this. What you may not be aware of is that it's possible that Nabal means not only foolish, as we can see from other biblical passages, like here in Deuteronomy 32:6. I'll move on because for sake of time. It's also possible that Nabal meant noble. There's this phenomenon in Semitic languages, the family languages from which Hebrew comes, where words in one language can mean one thing, and the same word, the cognate word, in another Semitic language can mean its opposite. So there's sort of opposite meanings to the same word in different Semitic languages. And that may be an evidence in the Arabic word Nabil, or maybe Nabal is a better example, both of which mean something like noble in Arabic. Possibly also an Amorite from the early second millennium. The word might have meant noble as well. And noble, if you think about it, is because of the opposite of foolish. And we may have this opposite phenomenon going on here in the name of Nabal. And so it's possible that with Abigail's explanation of Nabal and Nabal's, the original meaning of Nabal's name, there are two possible interpretations to my mind, at least. One, it's possible that Nabal, when he was named as a child, got the name Nabal from his parents, and that meant noble to them. They weren't thinking that it meant foolish. They were thinking it meant noble. But in the course of his life, Nabal lived foolishly. And so this double meaning of the word Nabal in Hebrew, noble but also foolish, was relevant, increasingly relevant for Nabal in the course of his life, and Abigail plays on it in the sense foolish when she describes him. The other option is that sometime maybe in the course of his life, either at birth or maybe as a nickname in the course of his adult life, Naval was named foolish, and maybe he had a different name when he was born. Maybe it was bestowed because he was a fool. He was a foolish man. People knew him that way. And so that name was then available in the sense foolish for Naval, for Abigail. It's a very striking example of how names, the meanings of names were available to people in this period. They knew what the names meant, and they could play on them. They could access them, the meanings of the names at need. So we have in these names three types of correspondence: semantic correspondence, so correspondence of meaning between the meaning of the name and the explanation for the name that's given. We have lexical correspondence between words in names and the explanations given. And then phonological correspondence between the sounds of names and the sounds that we find in the explanations for the names given. But I want to emphasize now that I've shown you through these examples that it isn't always the case that all of these types of correspondence are there at the same time. Sometimes one of these is present, one type of correspondence, just the sounds or just the semantics, say. But it may be that all three are there. And it may be that all three are there in interlaced ways, in complicated ways, as we've seen in cases like Sarah and others. I just want to emphasize, lastly, as well, that when you go to commentaries, you will often find people explaining names like we've seen today, like Moses or like Abraham. And they will say things like, this explanation of the meaning of the name is wrong. The Bible is unreliable here. It's not telling you how things really are. And what they often mean by that is that we've analyzed this name linguistically, and we can prove that etymologically the name meant something different. But I would encourage you to think more carefully than maybe commentators who say that are thinking. Actually, these people were very aware of the meanings of their names, and they were able to play on those meanings in very complex ways, in very sophisticated ways. And the meaning of the name is not necessarily something that we find just by discerning its etymology, by tracing its meaning back through language after language and century and millennium after millennium. Sometimes names had meanings in their own time and space and place. And when we read the Bible's explanations of names, we need to take a posture of listening and learning from what the Bible is saying about these names, rather than assuming that the Bible is incorrect in its explanations. Well, thanks very much. Can the name Naval, foolish or dog-like, we should come back to that. Can the name Naval, foolish, also correspond to his pagan ethnicity? Because he's also described as worthless, a term which is used as judges and correspond to Canaanite people who were called worthless. Know that we should necessarily infer his ethnicity from his worthlessness. So we shouldn't necessarily assume that he's a non-Israelite because he's worthless. That's not necessarily the case. So I'm not sure that that's the best way to think about it. And I should just clarify that his name can mean foolish. His name doesn't mean dog-like. I was referring to Calebite when sorry about that. I think I might have been confusing in that regard. Calebite might mean dog-like. Naval is the name that means foolish. So worthless fellow, son of Belial, seems to refer to his character. And actually that's at issue very much for the Canaanites. Well, not just their ethnicity. It's the reason that the Canaanites were punished is because of their sin. So that's what's in view there as well. Yeah. Any other questions? Is there any ancient Near Eastern literature that name a person after his or her death? Interesting question. I don't know. James might know of some. Depending on what you mean by that. There probably are death-related names. There are certainly names in which deities related to death are in the names, right? So very often ancient Near Eastern names have a god or a goddess in them, and there'll often be a sentence about a deity. Often the sentence makes a claim about what the deity does for the person, especially around their birth or maybe for their parents. And deities that are often related to death are certainly there in names. So you get the god Mot showing up in Ugaritic names, the god of death in Ugaritic names, or the god Nergal shows up pretty often in Mesopotamian names, who's a god of pandemics, illnesses, and so on. Yeah, so James has just put in the chat that in Egyptian people can sometimes be given dishonorable names after they've died in order to cast them in a bad light. Well, I turn it over to our moderator in that case. Thank you very much.
Now, I thank you so much, Dr. Howard, as well as Dr. James. Thank you so much. It is really a New Year treat to listen to both of you, and it is an eye opener for all of us. And this is my first time personally to listen extensively regarding names from the Old Testament. So thank you so much. Thank you so very much. And now I shall give the time for Dr. Paul Gupta, who is the president of HBI, for the closing remarks as well as for the closing prayer. Over to Dr. Gupta.
And I must say thank you to both Dr. Caleb as well as Dr. James for making the time and taking the time to be part of our webinar and to bring before our audience this topic and discussion on the names and how the formation of names existed in the Hebrew language. And actually you broadened it beyond that as you talked about how it was used in other cultures and contexts. But primarily, as we look at it from the Hebrew language, we do see a sense of how those names were formed and how they actually had these three different areas of influence in how the name was enabled and disabled. I did have a question, Dr. Caleb, and maybe you could answer it. I was trying to send it and it wouldn't go. But the question I had was, is there a time between or before the baby was born or after the baby was born? What time did a child get named in the Hebrew culture?
Yeah, so the assumption usually it's on the 8th day, right? The circumcision happens and a name is given. So far as I'm aware, I mean, this is how John the Baptist is, of course, named, right? When the time comes for his naming, the circumcision, the clarification that he's to be called John is made. One of the things that I regularly wrestle with is that we don't have texts which describe to us the naming process, how the naming was done and when and so on. And so it's entirely possible to my mind that already the children's names were picked out, were chosen beforehand, and were even called, given right from the first day. But the official naming, the kind of rite of passage occurred, let's say, around circumcision or something similar to that. So that would be. James, anything to add there?
No, nothing.
All right. Thank you so much for clarifying that. As I was listening to you talk about Moses and, drawing Moses out of the water and thinking about the name and the emergence of the name, the thought went through my mind, when did they actually call him Moses? And how did that fit into the process? And so that's why I was asking. In a non-Hebrew culture, and in particular our culture, parents have an aspiration, a very sense of, I would like my child to become somewhat great and super. And you even have people having called their children by the name of like Abraham Lincoln. It's not an Indian name, but they use that name to facilitate that. So it was very interesting to actually listen to your lecture today and your presentation and to understand how the Hebrews looked at it and how they viewed the naming of their children and how their names had relationship to sounds and lexicon and meaning, and how it actually had purpose also in some cases of how they call their children. And I think it was very good. And I think it really helps us understand, even as we walk through life and we have children in a generation that is before us, how do we begin to think about how do we name our children and how do we facilitate that process? Because maybe it is aspiration, but on the other hand, maybe God, you're going through a spiritual journey and God is working in your life and God helps you. And as a result, you actually end up making a choice on the name. And so this has been a very good exercise for all of us to see it and to watch it and to hear it. From an expositional point or exegetical point, as we look at the lexical development of these words and see how names have been derived and enabled. And so we do want to say thank you so very much. It has been very interesting because I think, like Jian was sharing, we had probably never heard a discourse like this in the past. And so we want to thank you so much. And I hope it'll begin to make us realize and think that names are not just given without any thought, but is actually an expression of our appreciation to our God for what he has done for us. And so it's wonderful to be able to say, also to think that a child will become something of significance is of value. And so I do want to say thank you so much, Dr. Caleb, and also Dr. James, for giving us this lecture and being part of our webinar. And I want to thank all those who joined us today. I'm sure that you have taken a step forward, and it was wonderful, especially to see you articulate it using the Hebrew language and so fluently. And we want to thank you so very much. And so with that, I will close with a word of prayer and thank you so much. Shall we pray together and receive the benediction? And now, Father, we thank you that you have a name. And because you have a name, we know, oh God, you're almighty, you're great, you're amazing. And even when Nehemiah began to pray to you, he acknowledged to Father that you are sovereign and you are the creator, God. And Father, as your names were very unique and special, it brings our relationship to you and helps us to praise you and worship you and glorify you. Father, today, as we have looked at listened to this very incredible presentation by both James and Caleb, I pray, Father, it'll cause us to think of how people have in the past, in different cultures, different contexts, at different times, enabled and facilitated the naming of their children. And Father, even as we walk through life and we try to help people understand the history behind the birth of a child, that we would actually begin to seriously consider how we would name our children and how it'll direct and relate to the opportunity for that child to be a blessing to many people. Just their name, so that people will know and the child would know how they were birthed into this world. And so, Father, we thank you for this presentation. I pray that you'll continue to be with James and Caleb as they continue to serve you. But also, Lord, that we who believe in the text of your revelation would learn to value your revelation in its original form, because how much meaning it brings to our understanding of truth. And even on a subject like this, on the names of individuals, how much we have learned today. Father, I pray that you'll bless all of us that listened and heard. And Father, that we will continue to ponder on these thoughts. And Father, maybe others, oh God, will not only think about the original language, but also think about the nature of studies that we can be engaged in as we try to understand who you are, what you have done, and how we can come to know you and worship you. And so, Father, minister to us this evening as we walk away from this awesome presentation. And now, unto him who is able to keep you from falling and to present you spotless before the throne of grace, may the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit be with each and every one of us now until the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. And all of God's people said, Amen. The Lord bless you, the Lord be with you, and may his countenance shine upon you all. And thank you, Dr. Caleb and Dr. James, for your time and your presentations.
May the Lord bless you.